For 2 days and nights, the MV Winner has been loading coking coal at the Queensland port of Gladstone. She'll sail tonight for Turkey with 200,000 tonnes on board. Coal is Australia's black gold, the country's most valuable export. Yet every tonne of coal burnt in the world's power stations and steel mills adds more than 2 tonnes of carbon dioxide to an overburdened atmosphere and to the warming of the globe.
If we are to reconcile our economic opportunity with environmental responsibility, Australia must aspire to be a world leader in clean coal technology.
We're promised that one day our cities will be powered by coal completely free of greenhouse gas emissions. But when?
It's not going to be all that quick. 10 years would be about the minimum, I would think.
It's also possible it won't work or it'll be too expensive.
A growing chorus from the Australian business world are calling for far more urgent action on climate change.
We ultimately have to get serious cuts, 60% reduction in emissions by around 2050 if we're ever going to stabilise the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
Well, that sort of scenario, 60% set for Australia, would have enormously damaging impact on our economy, on the price of petrol, on a whole lot of things.
But can Australians expect a cost-free solution to the threat of climate change? Tonight on Four Corners, what price global warming?
Greetings to everyone in Brisbane, and my sincere thanks for attending this very special screening of An Inconvenient Truth.
There's a packed house at the Brisbane Film Festival for a new documentary about global warming, starring the man who so nearly became President of the United States.
The climate crisis is a challenge to the moral imagination of every citizen on this planet.
An Inconvenient Truth is based around a climate change slideshow that Al Gore started to show a skeptical America back in the 1980s.
A friend of mine just brought back some pictures of what's going on in Greenland right now.
It's an unashamed polemic. But the evidence of global warming Al Gore can call on these days is much more compelling than it was 2 decades ago.
See these people here for scale? This is not on the edge of Greenland. This is in the middle of the ice mass. This is a massive, rushing torrent of fresh meltwater tunneling straight down through the Greenland ice to the bedrock below.
In 1992, they measured this amount of melting in Greenland. 10 years later, this is what happened. And here's the melting from 2005.
Just 3 weeks ago, a team from the University of Texas published evidence that the Greenland ice cap is melting 3 times as fast as earlier science suggested.
If Greenland broke up and melted, or if half of Greenland and half of West Antarctica broke up and melted, this is what would happen to the sea level in Florida. The area around Beijing that's home to tens of millions of people. Even worse, in the area around Shanghai, there are 40 million people.
Most of the Brisbane audience were already converts to the global warming cause.
I thought it was excellent. I thought it was about time that was, put up into the press and people could see it.
Do you think Australia's doing enough about it?
No, government's not. Politicians aren't, generally across the board. Commercial enterprises aren't, big companies aren't.
But some big companies want to do more. From a converted church hall in inner-city Sydney, a former international president of Greenpeace, Paul Gilding, now runs an environmental consultancy. His clients are some of the biggest names in Australian and international business.
It's changed Incredibly, in my view, in the last 12 months to 2 years. I mean, very recently, we've got discussions happening at the highest levels in the corporate sector and government going, oh dear, this really is very, very serious. This is no longer a significant environmental issue. This is actually a potential threat to human civilisation, quite literally. That's the conversation I've been having with CEOs of some of Australia's and some of the world's largest companies. And the conversations you have privately are quite extraordinary in terms of how seriously they now take it.
A few of those companies are even daring to speak their mind publicly. The lunches hosted by CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, give the denizens of the top end of town a chance to talk strategy to each other. In a series of recent CEDA lunches around the nation, the Business Roundtable on Climate Change made its pitch to corporate Australia. The main speaker at the Sydney lunch was the CEO of Dick Pratt's packaging giant, Visy Corporation.
Thank you very much, Catherine. This is a very well-attended lunch, and one of the things that we really are desperate to do is to raise the profile of the whole need for early action on climate change.
Sharing the podium with Harry Debney were representatives of the 5 other prominent Australian companies that make up the round table, including BP Australia, the Insurance Australia Group and Westpac Bank. They were presenting the findings of a report they jointly commissioned from the CSIRO on the likely effects on Australia of global warming.
In that report, you've got some very chilling information in terms of the impact on the environment, impact on business, and impact on the way we conduct our lives.
The CSIRO lays out the possible consequences if global greenhouse emissions aren't drastically curbed over the next few decades. In its worst-case scenario, the Great Barrier Reef is doomed. So are the snows of the snowy mountains. Most butterflies go extinct. Much of our eucalyptus forest is affected. The Kakadu wetlands dry up. Australia's pasture lands are degraded. Droughts are more frequent and prolonged. Water shortages far more severe. And if the West Antarctic and Greenland ice shelves should melt, sea levels could rise not by centimetres, but by metres. These effects are uncertain and may take a century or more. But the longer we take to start curbing our emissions, the Business Roundtable warns, the harder it will be to do later, and the more severe the consequences will be.
Whether we like it or not, there is growing pressure on us as companies to act. Well, I think, Jonathan, it's not just us that take it seriously. I think everybody does. I mean, the science debate's been won.
95% decline in species on the Great Barrier Reef.
It's true that these days public scepticism about the science of climate change is hard to find, no matter where you look.
I actually can't find on the record somebody from the coal industry in this country saying that they didn't think it's a problem. It is a big problem. We've got to do something about it.
Do you accept that global warming, climate change, is potentially a really serious threat, not just to Australia, but perhaps to Queensland in particular?
Yes, I do. And you even see the first evidence of that. We now have the worst drought on record, which covers a large part of the southeast corner of Queensland, bits of New South Wales, and a fair bit of Victoria. So yes, I do.
The nearest thing to scepticism about the dangers of climate change that I encountered came from the very top.
I accept that climate change is a challenge. I accept the broad theory about global warming. I am sceptical about a lot of the more gloomy predictions. I also recognise that a country like Australia has got to balance a concern for greenhouse gas emissions with a concern for the enormous burden to be carried by consumers through much higher electricity prices, higher petrol prices, falls in GDP of too dramatic an imposition of what you might call an anti-greenhouse policy. It's a question of balance.
And clearly that balance depends on how serious you think the threat is and how dramatic you think it is.
And also the pace of technology. Hello there. Nice to meet you.
It's technology that's the focus of John Howard's much-vaunted alternative to the Kyoto Protocol, the Asia-Pacific Partnership on Clean Development and Climate Change, known in diplomatic jargon as AP6.
We're going to have a class photograph here.
In January this year, it held its first formal meeting in Sydney. As John Howard likes to emphasise, its 6 members, America, China, India, Japan, South Korea and Australia, account for more than half the world's greenhouse gas emissions.
I mean, the great weakness of the Kyoto approach is that it does not contain the 3 largest emitters in the world. And the advantage of the Asia-Pacific Partnership that it does bring China and India and the United States, as well as Australia and other countries in.
Well, thank you and welcome to what will no doubt be remembered as a historic meeting between business and Asia-Pacific nations.
In fact, all the AP6 members, except the USA and Australia, are signatories of Kyoto. It's true that the Kyoto Protocol sets no mandatory limits for greenhouse gas emissions on developing countries like India and China.
Clean energy now.
But as the protesting greenies outside point out, nor does the AP6.
What we're seeing basically is a real furphy. It is a talk fest. It is actually taking us nowhere.
What the AP6 is talking about, first and foremost, is clean coal technology. To the protesters, that's a contradiction in terms. But in the real world, as even the former president of Greenpeace concedes, it's an essential part of the solution.
It's a very important part of a good strategy in response. Will clean coal technology work overall? I don't know. Do I want to find out? Absolutely, and as urgently as possible.
The facts are compelling. For every tonne of coal that's fed into the giant maw of the average power station today, 2 tonnes of carbon dioxide flows invisibly from its stacks into the atmosphere. Worldwide, coal-fired power stations produce about 1/5 of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. And that proportion is due to rise because in developing countries like India and China, demand for energy is soaring. The great Yangtze River, that once flowed freely through its gorges, has now been dammed to provide hydroelectricity. But that won't be enough. China's planning 39 new nuclear power stations, but they'll only meet a fraction of the expected demand. Renewable energy, like wind power, is currently too expensive and too intermittent to provide baseload electricity. Overwhelmingly, it's coal that is fueling the emerging giants of Asia.
It's safe to use, it's easy to get to, it's safe to transport, it's safe to store. And if you look at the sorts of analyses that the real energy experts like the International Energy Agency and others do, frankly, fossil fuels will still be a really big part of our energy supply in 30 or 40 years. And I just don't see any way of, a different outcome to that. That looks as though it's set in concrete to me.
An hour's flight west of Brisbane on a coalfield yet to be mined, Queensland is constructing a brand new 750 megawatt coal-fired power station. Kogan Creek may well be the last such station ever to be built in Australia. But in China in recent years, they've been building a power station as big as this every couple of weeks. Most of them, like Kogan Creek, are state-of-the-art. But today's technology does nothing to capture greenhouse gas emissions. Some 600 tonnes of carbon dioxide will pour from the giant stack at Kogan Creek every hour, 24 hours a day, for 40 or 50 years. Yet in that time, the scientists warn, if the worst effects of global warming are to be avoided, the world needs to cut its greenhouse gas emissions by more than half.
The task is absolutely immense. Can the world do it? Not without the sort of technologies we're trying to develop here.
We can do some things in Australia with our electricity supply system, but the real challenge is to be developing things that are going to help China, which is building Australia's entire generation system every 9 months.
The facts are that our emissions, if we stop them tomorrow, it would take all of 9 months for China's additional emissions to equal what we've withdrawn by stopping ours.
Welcome to the zero-emission city of the future. In this city, scientists have managed to revolutionise the way we produce our energy and, more importantly, the impact we have on the environment.
The profits of clean coal assure us that in 20 or 30 years' time, we'll be powering our cities with coal-fuelled power stations that emit little or no greenhouse gas at all. Before it's burnt, the coal will be turned into gas. That gas will be separated into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. The hydrogen, the visionaries say, could be burned to produce electricity or stored in fuel cells to power transport.
Down the road, we could transform the energy infrastructure in such a way that we are moving towards, if you like, a hydrogen-based economy.
Dr. Kelly Tambimutu was recently lured from Canada to head up the Centre for Low Emission Technology, CLET, in Brisbane. He's a globally respected chemical engineer who still chairs the International Energy Agency's Greenhouse Gas R&D program.
And the hydrogen will permeate through the membrane to the other side, leaving the CO2 behind. And
testing tiny membranes in a lab is one thing. Separating millions of tons of gas in a real power station is quite another. Dr. Tambimutu's a consultant on 2 of the world's biggest demonstration projects for the new technology. There's the FutureGen project in the United States, a commercial-scale demonstration plant that will produce power by burning pure hydrogen.
FutureGen is focusing on, if you like, cutting-edge next-generation technologies.
The Queensland Government's Stanwell Corporation plans to build a rather less ambitious pilot plant called ZeroGen on the site of its coal-fired power station outside Rockhampton.
Project Stanwell, or ZeroGen as it's called, will look at putting together the existing elements of the technology in an integrated sense.
Dr. Tambimutu expects that 90% of the carbon dioxide emissions from the new plant at Stanwell will be captured before they escape into the air.
You can capture more, but as you go towards the 99%, the cost will escalate.
Well, at 90%, it's a massive improvement on current coal-fired power stations.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The carbon dioxide, once captured, will have to be stored. And the only feasible place to store billions of tons of liquefied gas permanently is deep underground. 200 kilometres west of Rockhampton, in the Bowen Basin, they're drilling the first holes in Australia that are specifically looking for reservoirs to store waste carbon dioxide.
Now, is this a totally alien technology? No, it isn't, because it's being practiced around the world today.
The visionaries' favourite example of so-called geosequestration is Norway's Sleipner gas field in the North Sea. The natural gas that flows from deep underground up to the rig contains a generous mix of carbon dioxide. In a separation plant on the rig, the CO2 is separated from the useful fuel gas. It's then pumped back down deep underground to a saline aquifer, where it mixes with water that's already been trapped in the rock for millions of years.
Now, how feasible would that be for Australia? Well, anywhere where you find, if you like, oil and gas provinces, that means you have formations that are suitable. Very typically, Bass Strait, in Victoria, in parts of Victoria. There are other parts of Australia where you do find natural gas underground.
And there are places where you don't. like New South Wales's Hunter Valley. But there's a bigger problem. The new technology, so-called integrated gasification with carbon capture, means building brand new power stations. What's needed to make dramatic cuts in emissions sooner is a low-emission technology that can be bolted on to existing coal-fired stations in Australia and around the world. That won't be easy, and it won't be cheap.
So here at Melbourne, we're
In a lab at Melbourne University, for example, Barry Hooper's team is working on ways to separate carbon dioxide from the flue gas of existing power stations.
the way that's being done is the CO2 is dissolving in a solvent, be they amines, carbonates, and other materials are being investigated. It is taken to a regenerator where the CO2 is boiled out. The CO2 would then go to storage, compression and storage.
At the CSIRO's Energy Centre in Newcastle, they're hoping to build a $100 million pilot plant to demonstrate the process. Dr. John Wright says that will take 5 years.
If that demonstration plant is successful, then I would imagine it would take probably about another 5 years or so before we could demonstrate that at a commercial size. So 10 years would be about the minimum, I would think.
There's even less certainty about how much this fancy new technology might add to the cost of generating electricity from coal. Even the experts give widely varying estimates.
The sort of targets in the CO2 CRC is down at the range for the capture for post-combustion of around $20 per tonne.
$20 per tonne of CO2 would add roughly 50% to the current cost of coal-fired power.
I think it'll probably be somewhere between 30% more expensive and doubling the cost of power, somewhere in that range.
Overall, it might be of the order of 10% more.
Only 10%?
Only 10% more.
It is clearly the case, though, isn't it, that clean technology that produces electricity with low to zero emissions is always going to be more expensive than dirty technology. That's something we have to face.
Absolutely.
But that's not something John Howard is yet prepared to concede. Clearly, these new technologies, when they come along, are going to be more expensive than fossil fuels as we currently have them.
No, I don't necessarily accept that. We don't know yet what the cost-benefit analysis is going to be. It's too early to make that judgment. You say clearly they are. I don't speak with quite that precision. I think we have to wait and see.
And how long will we have to wait? According to the electricity generating industry, a minimum of 14 years.
Certainly there'll be plenty of research and development going on. There'll be demonstration plants, but they are demonstration plants, they are small scale. I've not been able to find anybody who with any degree of confidence can say to us that much before 2020 will any of our members or anybody else worldwide be able to go to any of the major suppliers of generation equipment and say to them, I'd like to order an IGCC plant with carbon capture and storage, please build it for me.
Clean coal is not the absurd proposition the more extreme environmentalists portray. But it's a long way off and surrounded by uncertainty. And in any case, the federal government's funding for clean coal research doesn't match John Howard's rhetoric.
If we are to reconcile our economic opportunity with environmental responsibility, Australia must aspire to be a world leader in clean coal technology. We are putting a lot of emphasis on low emissions technology. You will remember our white paper established a fund of 1.5 billion on that, and we'll be announcing the first projects to receive the benefit of that support very soon.
In fact, the government's putting only $500 million of taxpayers' money over 5 years into its low-emission technology development fund. $2 from the private sector must match every federal dollar. And perhaps only half of that will be spent on clean coal. there are plenty of other projects like the CSIRO's solar thermal technology competing for money from the same fund. Dr. Tambemutu says it's nowhere near enough.
Well, if I were to tell you that the US FutureGen power generation plant that is in the process of being designed for construction is going to cost $1 billion by itself. So clearly the technology costs are high.
What's needed is massive private investment. The Australian Coal Association, the Coal Companies Club, says it's put its money where its mouth is. It's raised $300 million from a levy on its members.
That's the first time anywhere in the world an industry has voluntarily raised an amount for this kind of non-commercial R&D. We think that's a pretty significant contribution.
Others are less impressed. Last week, BHP Billiton declared a global profit for the year of over $13 billion. Rio Tinto's was nearly $9 billion, Anglo-Americans over $5.
This is the boom times for the resource sector. They are investing insignificant amounts in these solutions, and they are in the best and most profitable times they've ever had.
Is $300 million?
It's nothing. It is simply nothing.
$300 million is not sufficient to solve the problem.
They haven't invested, they won't invest because there's not a business case for them to invest until there's a price on carbon.
Why would someone spend the money if there was no legal requirement to do so? All of our experience has shown that people do not voluntarily react to do this. There has to be some driver to encourage them to do it.
The Business Roundtable on Climate Change is just one group among many who say that Australian business and the Australian public need to start adjusting to a world where greenhouse gas emissions cost money.
And we make no apologies for the statement. We want to design a long, loud and legal framework to establish a carbon price signal to deliver cost-effective emission reductions.
Australia emits more greenhouse gases per head of population than any other nation on Earth. That's partly because it's home to high-emission industries like aluminium smelting. But it's also because Australians have big houses, heated in winter and cooled in summer by some of the cheapest electricity in the world, most of it coal-fired. Almost 40% of Australia's emissions pour from the power station stacks. And in most states, nobody is paying for it. Not the generators, not the retailers, and certainly not the consumer.
Remember what we're talking about here, they're a pollutant. We're not talking about some inert thing here. We're talking about the range of greenhouse gases. They're pollutants at excessive levels.
If the federal government were to say, in 2010 or 2012, we are going to introduce a carbon pricing signal, and it will start at X amount and it will go to Y amount, would that concentrate the minds of boardrooms in Australia?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We know that.
So what is a carbon price signal? Well, it's any mechanism that adds a cost to the bottom line of businesses that are emitting greenhouse gases. The simplest form is a carbon tax. For every tonne of carbon dioxide it emits above a certain level, a business has to pay $10 or $20 to the government. That tax could be made steeper or the limits tougher over time. It would give a real incentive to businesses to save energy or to invest in low-emission technology, even if it does cost a bit more.
How do you get the huge amounts of investments to flow into these things when there is so much uncertainty about policy frameworks and everything else? How do you get markets operating effectively to get those investment flows? That's where we're really focused.
I understand some are saying that. My response to them is that we have to tread very carefully with carbon taxes, because clearly until you have the major emitters as part of the process, you can't, in my view, have a process that won't impose unreasonable burdens on those that participate. Certainly if you are a net exporter of energy, such as Australia.
Developing countries like China and India compete with Australia's resource-based industries, John Howard argues. They're not compelled by the Kyoto Protocol to limit their emissions. And until they are, Australia should not limit itself.
Australia remains determined to pursue an effective global response on climate change that encompasses the world's major emitters. Unfortunately, Kyoto did not meet that test.
Is the current position that we are not going to put a price on carbon until the whole of the rest of the world does? Is that really where we are?
We believe that we have a lot of reservations about carbon taxes, because carbon taxes are going to impose huge costs on the Australian economy.
Every house in New South Wales is entitled to a packet.
John Howard's opponents argue that the costs would be minimal, especially if instead of a tax, Australia opted, as New South Wales has already done, for a carbon emissions trading scheme. Emissions trading, in theory, is a way of harnessing the power of the market. In the New South Wales scheme, electricity retailers are set compulsory targets for reducing the emissions caused by the electricity they sell. One way they can meet those targets is by buying so-called abatement certificates from companies who can prove that what they do actually reduces overall emissions.
What we're doing today, we're an environmental company called Easy Being Green, giving away these free of charge climate change packs.
Easy Being Green was the first of several companies who found a way of making money from the New South Wales greenhouse gas abatement scheme by involving the general public in the fight to reduce emissions.
I just happened to see it walking past after shopping, and I thought, what a great idea, you know, every little bit helps.
Everything in our environment is like being overused, and we don't think about it consciously that often in our days, so I think it's a great initiative, you know.
By promising to use the free energy-saving light bulbs and shower heads, householders earn a greenhouse gas abatement credit, which they assign to Easy Being Green. The company can then sell the credits to energy retailers. At current prices, the credits for each pack bring more than $70 to the company, enough to pay for the packs, the wage bill, and make a modest profit. Easy Being Green's CEO is the Ecos Corporation's Paul Gilding. He admits that the G-Gas scheme is complex and the paperwork extensive.
We spent a long time and a lot of money getting our system in place to the satisfaction of the government to get accreditation to do this. So that wasn't easy, but once we got it sorted, then it became a good business opportunity, a good employment opportunity, and most importantly, it's reducing CO2 emissions by large amounts every day. And we've now got 150,000 homes that have installed our pack of energy-efficient light bulbs and a water-saving shower head, each of them cutting CO2 emissions by 1 tonne.
Greenhouse entrepreneurs aren't restricting themselves to the left-leaning suburbs of the inner cities. Far out in the wheat belt, south of Condobolin, a company called CO2 Australia is planting thousands of mallee trees. The farmer gets many benefits. The trees will counter dryland salinity and soil erosion. And they're free. In fact, he's getting paid for the use of his land. CO2 Australia is making its money by claiming credits for the carbon each tree will lock up in its root and trunk and branches as it grows.
We're unique not only in Australia, but we're unique in the world, that we're an example of an entrepreneurial business in this emerging carbon economy where our whole business reason is we're a carbon credit creator.
Andrew Grant's trees don't start earning credits until they're 3 years old. And he and the landholder have to undertake that they'll be allowed to go on growing for 100 years. The New South Wales government makes big claims for its abatement scheme. What's the evidence that it's actually reduced the emission of greenhouse gases?
10 million tonnes, which is the equivalent of taking 2 million cars off the road.
Those figures are hard to verify. Indeed, some experts claim the New South Wales scheme is an expensive way of achieving very little in the way of genuine reductions. But for enthusiasts like Paul Gilding, the scheme's pluses far outweigh its minuses.
I think it's been an unparalleled success in the context of it being a very early scheme globally. Right, so has it got wrinkles? Yes. Has it got faults? Yes. Is it achieving CO2 reductions? Yes. And is it mobilising entrepreneurs like ourselves to grow new businesses in this space? Yes.
In the towers of the money men in Sydney and around the world, carbon trading is becoming big business. There's money to be made, they say, in trading carbon permits and credits, not just in New South Wales, but globally, thanks especially to the emissions trading scheme brought in by the European Union under the Kyoto Protocol.
Yeah, there's a huge global market in carbon credits. It's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. But a lot of Australian business at the moment is missing out on the opportunities that those regimes create. Well, I think across the Australian political spectrum, both in the federal government and elsewhere, that don't fully appreciate how the international mechanisms work and the advantages which they could present for Australia.
While known oil reserves are declining,
John Howard portrays the European Union emissions trading scheme as an almost total failure.
the EU scheme is beset with complexity and competing national interests. This has led to wild fluctuations and then a collapse in the price of traded carbon.
Westpac Bank's Noel Purcell is one of many who take a different view. The EU scheme, he points out, is still in a trial phase.
The first phase is always, have you got the allocations right? The market actually worked quite well there, because what it found out is there was over-allocation of emission permits. And so the price fell. It's now adjusting again. So it will take years to get that system totally settled and working properly.
Meanwhile, the carbon trading bandwagon is rolling on. Just a month ago, Britain's Tony Blair was with Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger when he announced that California, the world's 8th biggest economy in its own right, was committing to a mandatory emissions trading scheme.
I think the message is that we do not wait for the federal government, that we will move forward because we know it is the right thing to do.
That does lie within our own hands to take the power to get this job done, and we have to get it done. And if we don't, I wouldn't like to be the political leader when in 15, 20, 30 years' time, people look back and say, well, what on earth were they doing at this time? There was the evidence and they didn't act.
So it's icebergs. Yeah, just thing.
On Sydney's Bondi Beach 2 weeks ago, the 3 southeastern mainland states launched a discussion paper outlining their proposal for a national emissions trading scheme.
And so we're releasing today for discussion this model to act on climate change, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, protect the economy, keep investment and jobs going, and to protect families. Most importantly, to ensure that we don't pass on to our children the debt of no action.
If we're serious about tackling climate change, we have to show leadership. But ultimately we have to...
According to the premiers, the scheme will add no more than $2 a week to average household electricity bills by 2030. But John Howard is unmoved.
Mr. Speaker, until we have all the major emitters, the idea of one country unilaterally embracing an emissions trading scheme will result in great damage to that country.
Order. In fact, he's using the opportunity to drive a wedge between the southeastern states and the resource-rich states of the north and west.
To borrow a phrase that's beloved of the Queensland Premier, let me say to Mr. Beattie, why don't you stand up for Queensland? Why don't you stand up for jobs in the coal industry in Queensland?
And indeed, Peter Beattie's enthusiasm for a national emissions trading scheme could hardly be described as burning.
In general terms, we're supportive of it, but we're not going to see the Queensland regions devastated when I think at the end of it, technology is the answer.
Peter Beattie's problem with any form of carbon price introduced now is exactly the same as the coal industry's. Its only effect, they both argue, will be to make electricity generators invest in gas and drive investment, public and private, away from expensive long-term research into clean coal technology.
Governments right around the country would then say, well, we've done our bit on climate change. They would just take their hands off the policy levers entirely and leave it to the gas industry to celebrate. I'd simply say we now have a trading scheme. You always said that the market would sort this out, so there it is.
Politicians are really good at doing this. That's what we're going to do. We're going to have this carbon trading regime, and aren't we absolutely bloody wonderful? We've fixed the problem about greenhouse gas emissions, and we can all go out and have a red wine and say we're terrific, without investing significantly in technology, and governments have to do that. There has been a reluctance in this country to do it.
Peter Beattie is putting $300 million of Queensland taxpayers' money into clean coal research. Victoria has committed $80 million. But New South Wales has no plans to follow suit.
No, it's our state-based, our greenhouse gas abatement scheme is our effort to send the appropriate signals to be more efficient and to invest in alternative sources of energy.
You need to do both, and you need to do both at the same time, and you simply cannot see carbon trading as the answer on its own. That's my concern. And I get infuriated by this debate when I have people, including my colleagues, who see carbon trading as the panacea and the answer in itself. It is not.
10 years is enough. Climate action now.
While the politicians argue, it's not just the Greenies who are getting impatient.
By delaying action, not only are we making the task an awful lot harder, we're also making it an awful lot more expensive.
My question...
I actually find it hard to find a major corporate in Australia, with some exceptions, but by and large, there are very few who agree with the government's position. They recognise a price on carbon is inevitable and that their businesses are threatened by too late action. But they're now nervous that they don't want to upset the federal government, which hasn't moved on.
Would it be fair to say that what you're looking for is leadership?
I think we've got leadership, and I'm not underestimating the complexity of the issues. They are difficult. No one is contesting, at least no one at any major government level, nor at any major business level, nor the coal lobby, that we ultimately have to get serious cuts, 60% reduction in emissions by around 2050, if we're ever going to stabilise the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
But that's just what is contested at a major government level.
Well, that sort of scenario, 60% set for Australia, would have enormously damaging impact on our economy, on the price of petrol, on a whole lot of things. And it would have a very big impact on our GDP, because to achieve that, you would have to impose a carbon tax.
And you don't believe that it is necessary for Australians to pay more for their electricity, to have to make quite drastic changes in order to solve this problem?
Well, I want to see the evidence, I want to see the science, I want to see the proposition. I mean, these sweeping generalisations are next to useless.
By and large, I agree with the Prime Minister. That's true. You've identified that. I, by and large, agree with the Prime Minister, because I know one thing about electricity prices. People are not going to want to pay any more than they have to.
Science can be sure about the past. About the future, it can only make well-educated guesses. And politicians, with elections round the corner, never want to tell us what we don't want to hear, unless the threat is plain for all to see. The problem for our children is that by the time that happens, the choices may be tougher by far than those that face us now.
You can watch this program again online from tomorrow morning. Meanwhile, from 9:30 tonight Eastern Time, join a discussion with Jonathan Holmes, Paul Gilding and Kelly Tambi Mutu at abc.net.au/4corners.